Welcome to the Plant-Free MD podcast with Dr. Anthony Chafee, where we discuss diet and nutrition and how this affects health and chronic disease, and show you how you can use this to optimize your health and happiness, both mentally and physically.
In 2010, I changed my diet. Before that, I'd been prescribing the high carbohydrate diet. I wrote the book Law of Running, which promotes a very high carbohydrate diet. And this became a very popular book. And classically, I've been seen tearing the pages out saying, I don't believe this. And anyway, so now I'm rewriting the 5th edition. But that promoted the high carbohydrate diet. And all that happened to me on the high carbohydrate diet was I developed type 2 diabetes. And then I was fortunate to read books on the low carbohydrate diet. I adopted the diet, reversed my type 2 diabetes, and just felt magic and just I felt like 20 years younger. So it was an amazing experience. The consequence of changing my diet was I lost all my funding because the people who were funding me were interested in promoting the plant-based high carbohydrate diet. And they did that obviously for financial reasons. And so I lost all that funding. And then the university turned on me and it basically excommunicated me by saying that by promoting this diet, the low carbohydrate, high fat diet, I was killing people, killing babies and so on.
Oh, wow.
And so they turned their back on me, despite the fact that I'd worked there for 40 years and developed this center of excellence. And I'm just going to boast now that I'm the second most cited medical scientist at that university. Despite that, they threw me out and tried to humiliate me publicly. And I realized that I had a choice. I could either be humiliated publicly or stand up. Then it turned out, very fortunately, that I tweeted something and I was reported to the Health Professions Council in South Africa for saying that mothers should wean their babies onto a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, as we've done for millions of years.
Yeah.
But of course, people don't know the history. So that anyway, we then went to court for 4 years. I was in court for 28 days. Had a brilliant support team. And in the end, we won that and we won the appeal. And so I had been charged for misconduct, etc. That I was cleared of everything. They found nothing wrong. There were 13 charges and I won all 13 points. So that left me in limbo. And fortunately, and we'll talk about this, I think, that a young South African who's now working in America, he'd become interested in the low carbohydrate diet. He said, why don't we start doing some studies? Wouldn't you like to help us? And so I did. And we've now over the past 6 years, we've done some magnificent work that's never been done. And we reversed 100 years of teaching in the sports sciences. The evidence is about to break. It's not quite there, but I mean, it's about to be published, but it's there. Then I can tell you a bit about it.
And you caught a lot of heat for that, and I think it just takes a lot of integrity. And I just so want to congratulate you for that and thank you for that, because without your struggles, we would be 10 years behind, and we would be really struggling at this point. So I appreciate that.
Thanks, Anthony. For me, it was really simple because I got diabetes on my own advice. So here I'm giving this advice, and it caused me to get diabetes. So how could I live with myself to let that continue, knowing that this book is ranked as a great book on running? So everyone who picks it up is going to say, well, it's got to be high carbs. And the probability that they'll get diabetes in the long term is very high. So I couldn't live with that.
Yeah.
In any case, it changed my life so much. I just wish I was originally high fat, low carbs because I was born to British parents in Rhodesia in Zimbabwe. And there were no processed foods when I was born. And my mother used to say that meat and fish are what give you brains. That's what she said. So when Philip Prince approached me he's from Grove City College in Pennsylvania, which I see is it's a small college, but it's highly rated in America. And he just happens to have an amazing laboratory. And he can do clinical trials on runners and cyclists with great results. They're just very good at doing that work. And all he needed was a direction. So what research should we do? So he asked me, I said, well, why don't we test the high carb diet, high fat diet? by putting people on a high carb diet for 6 weeks or so, and then having them do a performance trial, and then reversing that and putting them on a high fat diet for 6 weeks. And of course, we didn't do all of them at the same time. We broke them in half, etc., because that's the only way you can do it. So we do these randomized controlled trials, and we started at 5 kilometers. So I said, well, can you do reproducible 5K time trials on the treadmill in your laboratory? He said, yes, we get very good results. So I said, okay, well, let's do 5K time trials on these guys. And so we did. And we also did VO2 max tests before on the different diets. And guess what? VO2 max was exactly the same. And the 5K time trial was exactly the same, the performance. So the performance didn't change. So then I said, yeah, but what they're going to say is that it's because the guys still had some glycogen. Even though you're on a high fat diet, you still got enough glycogen to run 5Ks. I said, let's put the intensity of the exercise up and then do an activity which will produce muscle glycogen depletion. So we said, right, let's make it a 1 mile time trial. So we put the speed up to the 1 mile, and then they did the same experiments. And there was no difference again. The performance was identical. So those people eating a high-fat diet can run 1 mile just as fast whether they're eating carbs or fat. And then I said, okay, fine, let's do 6 times 800 meter intervals, because everyone knows that that's going to deplete your glycogen. So even if they start with some glycogen, by the third or fourth, they're going to have no glycogen left, and they're just going to fall over and not be able to exercise. So, of course, that didn't happen. The performance was identical for the 6 times 800 meter repetitions. And then by chance, because I didn't tell Philip to do this or suggested it, he measured oxygen consumption while they were doing the intervals. And we measured the fat oxidation rates. Now, the textbook says the following, and this is the Bible that I taught for 40 years, that there's a so-called crossover point, that as you increase your exercise intensity, you reach a point where you can only burn carbs. You can't burn fat. And that's usually at 85% VO2 max. And that idea was developed by a great friend of mine, George Brooks, who taught me so much. He helped us. When we did the studies of carbohydrate metabolism, we used tracers, and he was the expert on tracer methodology in the world. And he came to Cape Town and he showed us how to do it, and we've been friends ever since. So it's not as if I wanted to go out and disprove him at all. That was never the goal. We just happened to find this. So what we discovered was that when they ran the 6 times 800 meter intervals, they were running at 86% VO2 max. By chance, God came along and said, it's 86% VO2 max. So they were 1% over, and so they should have been burning 0 fat. They burnt the highest rates of fat oxidation ever recorded in humans in history. Nice. 1.5 grams per minute, it is enormous. I mean, that provides 3/4 of the energy to run a sub-2-hour marathon just by burning fat. So why do you need carbs? So anyway, that was what we found. Mm-hmm. But then I'll tell you what we did. You see, so we now had a model where we could change muscle glycogen before the start of exercise. And we had found that it made no difference running at those distances. So I said, okay, well, let's now do a long, prolonged exercise so that the guys get out and cycle at 70% of the VO2 max or whatever, and they go for as long as they can. And we're going to have them start with more muscle glycogen or less muscle glycogen because they followed the diets. And then we're going to give them just enough glucose, just enough to make sure that the blood glucose doesn't fall. Not enough to modify the metabolism, just enough to keep their glucose normal. And I had worked this out because it became apparent to me that in all these studies of carbohydrate metabolism and muscle glycogen depletion, no one was worried about the blood glucose level. They just ignored it. And I noticed that a lot of the studies, the blood glucose levels were low, including in the famous Bergstrom study, which is the one on which the whole thing is based. They took people, they put them on a high carbohydrate diet, had them exercise for as long as they could, and they found that the more carbohydrate in the muscle, the longer you could last for. And they said, you see, therefore, it's all muscle glycogen. But what they ignored was that everyone blood glucose levels dropped. They just ignored it. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, up to 1939, the teaching in sports science was that hypoglycemia, a falling blood glucose, is what causes fatigue. And that was the model. And it was said it's a brain effect. How do I know this? Because it was written in German, two famous writers, Christensen and Hansen, but they published it in German and no one bothered to read the articles. So I had the articles translated by a friend of mine who's a German. And he translated the sections, and there it said, what happens is when you take glucose, if you're tired, you take glucose and your performance goes up. It's just correcting your blood glucose level. It's got nothing to do with metabolism in the muscles, nothing at all. And they presented all the evidence for that. So that was the model. The model was falling blood glucose, your brain cuts in and says, I can't continue to exercise or your blood glucose is going to go low and the brain's going to be damaged. So you must stop exercising. And that's the logical solution. So as I was working through it, I noticed that there were some studies where minimum amounts of carbohydrate improved performance. You didn't have to take huge amounts.
Yeah.
So that was the experiment we did. And we've done the studies and they're about to be submitted, in which we compared what must you do? Must you take carbohydrate during exercise or before exercise? And the key was that before exercise, the people every day were taking, let's say, 300 or 400 grams of carbohydrate more. And what effect did that have on performance? That's the question. But during exercise, they only took 10 grams an hour. So they took 20 grams. During a 2-hour experiment, they took 20 grams of carbohydrate. Now, everyone will tell you, oh, it's the 400 grams before exercise that makes a difference, and not the 20 grams during exercise. Well, let's see what the results showed.
Yeah.
Because they might bring some nice, exciting surprises. Yeah, so the benefit of keto adaptation is that you can exercise with too much lower blood glucose levels. So that's a huge advantage. And we have answered your question, and I can't answer it because it's not been published. So
okay,
so,
we'll wait for that.
However, but I've always considered that it's the ultra exercise, the Ironman and so on, where you'll really get the benefits. Because when your glucose starts to fall, that's the one thing that if you're keto adapted, you won't notice it and you'll continue to exercise vigorously. So that's the one difference. We are involved with another group in Australia, and they're looking at high fat diets and more prolonged exercise, including marathons and ultra marathons. And I think that's where the low carb diet will really be beneficial. So we've looked at very little exercise, small amounts of exercise, just 2 hours. And I can tell you at 2 hours, what you eat before exercise makes no difference whatsoever. None at all.
Yeah.
And that's a breakthrough. But the other breakthrough is, when do you need your carbs? When do you need to take them? And you do need them.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you put 2 and 2 together, you'll know what I'm saying, but I can't say it yet. Yeah. So my best rugby story about a rugby player is a chap called David Pocock, who captained the Australian rugby team and was known for being such a very vigorous athlete. So he was born in Zimbabwe, as I was, and he said the one thing he wanted to do in life was play rugby for South Africa. For various reasons, his parents left Zimbabwe and he settled in Australia. And he said he was so upset by the move that he couldn't eat properly, and he became a vegan. And then he still became Australian captain, eating a vegan diet. And then he read my book about low carb diets, and he converted. And he came to South Africa and he said, thank you, because this is what I did. And exactly what you said. He said, I was a better player. The irony is that when he wrote to me was just after the 2011 Rugby World Cup, and South Africa got knocked out in the quarterfinals when we should have perhaps won. But anyway, we got knocked out, and it was all because of David Pocock.
Yeah.
and like yourself, he's got this huge upper body, and he was just so powerful.
That's funny. You probably would have hoped that he came across your book after the World Cup, so he didn't have that expected advantage.
we also, by the way, we also converted half of the Australian cricket team as well. during that period because my friend was Peter Bruckner was the doctor. And Peter had converted to this diet because of what I'd written, and his own health had improved. And he was caught reading one of the great books on low-carb diets. And Shane Watson, brilliant cricketer, said, "Doc, what you reading?" So he said, "No, he's talking about low-carb diets and so on." And Shane said, I've always had a problem with weight. I'm always overweight at the start of the season, and I'd fast and I'd do all these things. But by the end of the season, it was finished. He then converted, and he became one of the great players in the Indian Professional League. One of the outstanding players, and he retired at 39.
Yeah, wow.
And he'd been on the diet for 7 years, and that prolonged his career for 7 years.
Yeah.
So many reasons why I'm proud that I converted, because I helped a lot of athletes.
Convert to
Yeah, again, I think it's the same story that people don't want to talk too much about it. But when I look at the Springbok rugby team, I definitely think that they've changed. They're much more muscular than they were. They don't have that padding of fat that they tend to have high carb athletes. Whereas if I watch tennis, and particularly women's tennis, you'll see they've all got this padding. So although they're very strong women, they're on high carb diets, you can see, and I can't see that would be of any advantage to them. So before the 2019 Rugby World Cup, there was a picture of the South African team just in their shorts, and someone said that's the team that's going to win because they look fantastic, and I can't think that they look like that on high carbohydrate diets, but they keep quiet about it. And so it's the same in the Tour de France. The Tour de France, they eat enormous amounts of carbohydrate because it's the cult. And if there are cyclists who are eating high-fat diets, they're not going to say it because it would be against the cult and they would be excommunicated. In fact, the South African who I helped, and he has turned professional recently, on a high-fat diet, he said, "I can't talk about the high-fat diet," because they said, "You will eat a high-carbohydrate diet if you're on this team."
There was, for a while there was a number of the All Blacks rugby players that were going low carb, keto, and then but then Weet-Bix was their major sponsor, and they're like, "That's enough. You can't talk about this low carb stuff anymore." So like, oh, all right. But I've actually had a few of the people that I think it was around 2015 or so that they started making that switch. And I actually had one of those players. I won't say his name because I haven't asked him, but he has been an All Black for a number of years, probably a decade or so, and he has been low carb, really zero carb, and basically carnivore, full carnivore. Like on the off season, he only eats meat, and then he might add in a little bit of stuff during the season. But for the last 8 years, he's been doing that, but just doesn't talk about it. You just have to sort of keep it under wraps. I guess it's for sponsorships, but also because, if everybody knows the secret, well, then it's not really a secret anymore, and you're just on an even playing field.
One of my students from South Africa went to New Zealand, and she was a dietitian who we trained, and we trained on the high carbs, And so she goes to Auckland, and one day in about 2014, 2015, maybe a bit earlier than that, Grant says to her, "I'm hearing about this high fat story. What do you think? I'm sure it's wrong, but what do you think?" So she went away for a month and researched, and she came back. She said, "Grant, we've been wrong all this time. We have to change." And the Auckland University of Technology is one of the centers for studying low carb diets in the world. It's done brilliant work. Nice. And that was because Grant, the professor, who was also an elite ultra distance athlete, he also decided to change and found that helped him. And they then incorporated that, and they started working with the Auckland All Blacks. And I think that's where it sort of started. Yeah, so there's a paper published in the Journal of Applied Physiology about 3 or 4 months ago. And if I have difficulty pronouncing the guy's name, I think it's Lukaszewicz, something like that. And he did a really good model, but models are not science. They are a projection. They're not an experiment. You base it on all your assumptions. So I took the article and I said, it's really interesting. Let's see if there are any flaws in it. because he concluded that you couldn't run a sub 2-hour marathon unless you're eating carbohydrates at 90 to 120 grams per hour. That's the finding. You cannot run a sub 2-hour marathon unless you take in 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrate every hour for 2 hours. So I went through very carefully his model. So his model was valid. It's valid. But he made two assumptions that destroy the model. Otherwise, in other words, on the models the assumptions he made, fine. But there were two assumptions that unfortunately undermined the study. The first one is that you don't burn any fat when you're running a 2-hour marathon because you're running at 90% VO2 max. And that's contentious because we've shown you can burn a lot of fat when you're exercising vigorously. But he could still say, no, but I'm right. Athletes can't burn when they're exercising that vigorously. Fine. Okay. That's your point. Go and study it. But until you've studied it, we'll accept that. But the one major error was that when you take in carbohydrates 120 grams per hour, he assumed that 120 grams was being burnt every hour from point one. And that doesn't happen because when you take carbs, they take time. It takes about 60 minutes to 90 minutes before you reach these high rates of oxidation. And so you've got this lag phase. And during that lag phase, athletes couldn't burn the amount of carbohydrate he said they needed to run that race. So therefore, his model proves that you can't run a sub 2-hour marathon on carbohydrates alone. So then when you retweak the model, it turns out that if they burn a little bit of fat and like 7.7 grams a minute, which is not much, you're fine. You can take a little bit of carbs during the race and you'll be fine. So in trying to prove that carbohydrates are absolutely essential for a sub 2-hour marathon, he disproved it, which is fantastic. He proved you can't do it on carbs. Therefore, you have to do it adapted to a higher fat diet. What I've learned in this study, is that there are these two pools of glucose in the body. The one is the liver and the blood glucose, and the other is the muscle glycogen. And they serve totally different functions. No one tells you that. Just take the carbs. You need the carbs. No. There are two different control mechanisms. And the first mechanism, which is the important one, is that the body regulates the blood glucose concentration. So anytime you take in glucose, and particularly even during exercise, the body's first response is get rid of the glucose out of the bloodstream, burn it or store it. That's the rule. It's nothing to do with, I need it for the fuel in my muscles. That's not what's going on. The body says, this is a catastrophe. You've got to keep the blood glucose normal. And it's my impression and belief now, having read so much, that the reason why you have muscle glycogen is simply to store the excess glucose. So you dump the glucose. So when you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, because remember, we were carnivores for millions of years. We don't have the capacity to store much glycogen. We have glucose, to keep the blood glucose normal. We just got to dump that glucose out of there and into the muscles. And then what happens is the moment you start exercising, you're going to burn that stuff because the body says, I've got to get rid of that rubbish that's in the muscles. Get rid of it. Because this guy's, I know in an hour or in 6 hours' time, he's going to have another carbohydrate meal. And I want to store that carbohydrate. So that's how I see muscle glycogen. I see it simply as a reservoir for the excess glucose in the bloodstream. It serves no other particular function. Whereas the glucose in the bloodstream has a vital role, because if your blood glucose falls, you can damage your brain. So that becomes the priority in human metabolism. The number one priority is keep the blood glucose flat. That's the number one priority. And so it's very clear that when you take glucose, the body wants to get it out of the bloodstream as soon as it possibly can. And when you've got lots of muscle glycogen, the body wants to get rid of that. Now, what's really interesting, when you go one step further, the muscle glycogen controls its own metabolism. And it does that through insulin. So if you start exercise with a high muscle glycogen, the insulin is high. and that inhibits fat oxidation. And as a consequence, you have to burn the glycogen, and that's the body's design. You're going to burn that glycogen first. If, on the other hand, you start with little muscle glycogen, your insulin is low and your fat oxidation is much increased. And so you burn fat. And that's how the system works. And people think, well, that you just take glucose and it goes and it's distributed equally throughout the body. And that's simply not the case. But the key point that I've emphasized is muscle glycogen regulates its own use. Now, why would that be? Why would that be? And why would muscle glycogen not break down to glucose, which then gets into the bloodstream? You'd think you're storing all this glycogen, and you need the glucose in the bloodstream. That's what you want to protect. Why doesn't the muscle release glucose? It's designed not to, because that would interfere with your blood glucose regulation. So the blood glucose regulation is fixed on the liver. That's the controls. And the muscle glycogen is a completely different control mechanism. But no one has ever said that that's what's happening, at least in the physiology science, in the sports sciences. Yeah. It's all about take as much carbohydrate so you can fill your muscle glycogen. Actually, you're filling it because you're trying not to kill yourself. The body's saying, don't kill me with all this glucose.
A mutual friend of ours, Dr. Gary Fettke, said that above a certain level of glucose in the blood, it's toxic. It's a toxic dose to the body, and your body responds to it as a toxin by trying to detoxify it and raising insulin to force this out. And that's what it does. It gets shoved in into glycogen in your muscles, in your liver, turns into fat. And also intramuscular fat, so myosteatosis, which when we look at MRIs, we see this as pathological. We see, especially in spinal surgery, this is something we've seen strong correlations with back pain and poor outcomes with spinal surgery is myosteatosis in the paraspinal muscles. That's something that we've actually long seen, that this is that you have someone with myosteatosis in those muscles would be like, they're probably going to have a bad outcome, even if you fix the defect and the compression. So this is something that's pathological. We're putting ourselves into a pathological state, and yet we're thinking that this somehow gives us super magic powers when it comes to athletics, and that not only does it give us a better outcome, it's the only way we can get an outcome. It's the only way you can perform as an athlete, even though we've been high performance athletes as carnivores, hunting mammoths and being endurance hunters and chasing down animals until they just get too tired and lay down, and you just go up to them and take them out. They still do that here in Australia. I have a friend of mine who just got sick of working in the normal life and just said, "Yep, I'm going out." And he just started living out in the bush. And very interesting guy, Adam Cavanaugh. I interviewed him, and he lives with these rural Aboriginal Native Australians. That's how they hunt. They just chase down a kangaroo or something and just keep running them down. Exactly. He says they only make it about a kilometer, and then they're just so hot and overheated, and that's it. Yeah. It's, so we've been high performance athletes for a long time. There was a fossil record in the clay. It was a sort of clay beds. It was still wet at the time, and they found these footprints. They're, I don't know, something like 20, 30,000 years old, of Native Australians. And they were obviously chasing something, and they were sprinting, and they looked at the stride length, and some of these guys were going, faster than Usain Bolt. It was just absolutely flying. Yeah. And these were just normal guys. They weren't training for, the Olympics or anything like that. They were just hunting. And so how is it possible that we've been such high performance athletes who were able to take down animals that outclassed us by every physical metric? We talk about the megafauna and things like that. That's, that takes some serious doing to take something like that down. And we were doing it for millions of years. So how are we not anything except these amazing athletes on a zero carb diet? How are we not designed for that? It doesn't make sense to me.
So Weston Price, who obviously you know all about, when he traveled around the world and looked at the original diets of these people who hadn't changed their diet, he said the Australian Aborigines and the Plains Indians were the most beautiful people he'd ever seen. And they were the most healthy people. But as soon as they started eating the industrial diet, of course, their health went much worse.
Yeah. There was a paper in 2001 that came out, and they talked about like there was some work that was done by some anthropologists in the late 1800s with the Plains Indians in America, and they found that they were, different tribes were sort of different heights, but they found that these were on average the tallest human beings on Earth. And I believe it was the Cheyenne. The adult male height was about 5'10". That was on average, and this was much higher, taller than the rest of the world. The very interesting thing about this is some people look at that and are like, well, that's sure, that's tall for an average, but it's not like crazy
Yeah.
tall compared to today's figures. The interesting thing was that this was after they were put on the reservations and didn't have access to their traditional diet. They had already started to become westernized, and they'd
And
already
of
started
course,
having their diet corrupted. And so
yeah.
in their work and in his work, they even said that speaking to them, they say, we were normally much taller. We're shorter now. And so he was saying, wow,
Yeah.
you guys are so tall. And he's saying, you have no idea. We're normally much taller than this. We've actually gone down. And it was theorized that if they checked this 100 years earlier, probably would have been much higher. Some of the paintings from the late 1700s, and the scale that they found that a lot of these people from the Great Plains were probably pushing 7 feet tall. They're very, very tall. Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, some of them came out to see him and to meet him as diplomats, and he was 6'2", 6'2 and a half. So he's not a short guy, especially for the time. And he said that they were absolute giants, that these guys towered over him, that they were absolutely huge. And, they're just living a normal life. There's a book about the native Australians in the 1800s. I think it's called Kings in Grass Houses. And they talk about how actually they were actually very tall. They talk about a number of these people who were just basically these gentle giants, or extremely tall.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, this gentle giant in the story got killed. And when people came after and looked at the bones that were just sort of strewn about, and they're sort of uncovered by the sands, they found that some of these skeletons were just on just a different scale, and that some of these, the forearms, just the ulna and the radius, were longer than the entire outstretched arms of the British soldiers.